What is up, YouTube? 'Tis I, Chattington, coming to you live from somewhere on that map back there. Just take my word for it. We are doing another rugby reaction video. If you haven't seen some of my other reaction videos for rugby, be sure to check those out. But people have been telling me a lot in the comments that I need to learn about the rules of rugby, so I figured I would watch Rugby for American Football Fans. Kind of get the hang of it. It's kind of ironic that I'm not really an American football fan, however I'm much more familiar with it, so I figured this would be a good starting point to get into the game. Without further ado, let's hop into the video.
Rugby explained for American football fans.
All right, to get things started, I want you to picture one of those wild plays at the end of some football games when there's no time left on the clock and the team with the ball needs to score a touchdown. So it's basically a mad scramble with a bunch.
And that's when they have to pass it backwards. I know where they're going with this. I'm a genius.
Of laterals and backward tosses with the hope that by doing this, they will eventually be able to break through the defense and score. You're watching some now, so it shouldn't be too hard to picture this. Now, imagine a game where every play is like this. So in our imaginary game, every play is this type of desperate, mad scramble. In this game, there are no forward passes. And in fact, a player on offense is not even allowed to fumble.
That's the classic rugby throw where you like spin it, but yet you throw it underhand as opposed to American football, which is like this. Could you throw a rugby ball overhand? Probably. Probably would be a little bit cumbersome, though.
Fumble the ball forward or knock it forward accidentally. In this game that we're imagining, play doesn't stop when a player is tackled. The player just gets the ball to a teammate and the scramble continues. In this game, in order to score a touchdown, you actually have to touch the ball down on the ground in the end zone. And finally, imagine that no one in this game is wearing helmets or pads or anything like that. If you can visualize what this imaginary game might be like, you are well on your way to understanding rugby. In fact, rugby and American football.
I'm a tall and skinny individual, so I would never play rugby. But hey, throw me in with the ladies, and I might enjoy it. Please forget I said that.
All more or less descend from the same game, which explains their many similarities. We'll get to the history of all of this later in the video.
2 codes of rugby.
Now, if you want to understand rugby, the first thing to know is that there are actually 2 distinct versions or codes of rugby. And these games are different enough from one another that they are usually considered to be 2 distinct sports.
Really? So that's like, if we're talking about basketball terms, which is my favorite sport, it's like the difference between the NBA and the WNBA. Right?
Older and more widely played version or code of rugby is officially called rugby union, and rugby union will be blue for the purposes of this video. The slightly, but only slightly, newer code is called rugby league officially, and this is the dominant version of rugby in Australia, especially on the East Coast, in Northern England, and in certain Pacific Island nations, including Papua New Guinea, where it's the national sport. Rugby league will be yellow for this video. Each of these games generally goes by the simple name rugby when it's being played, and sometimes they use the even more generic term football. So it's important to know which version of rugby you're watching, because again, they are different enough from one another that they are essentially different sports. Now, in the United States, the predominant form of rugby is rugby union, and this is the game that most people are referring to when they just say rugby. And again, this...
Hold on, so in the US we have a third one, or is that, he said, rugby blue, then rugby league, and then in the States it's rugby union? How does that work?
This is also the case internationally for the most part. Rugby league is much less common in the United States. In fact, Wikipedia says that there are only about 700 registered players in the US. However, international rugby league matches are shown regularly in the US by at least one cable network, Fox Soccer Plus. So for some people in the United States, rugby league might be the only version of rugby that they have available to them on television. Because of this, and because I know this channel has an international following, and also because like you might go to Australia and want to watch rugby and need to know what's going on, we're going to be covering both versions of rugby in this video. We will get to what makes each version of rugby unique later in the video. Let's begin with a general overview that applies to both games.
General overview.
Ow.
Rugby, in general, is a contact sport played without pads or helmets, contested between two teams of either 13 or 15 players, depending on the version of rugby. There are 7-a-side and 9-a-side versions of rugby. These are shorter and faster-paced versions of the game that are often played at festivals. Rugby is played on a field that is 100 meters long and at least 68 meters wide. So that's 109 yards long and at least 74 yards wide. The field has
So roughly the same size as a football field, which is 100 yards.
markings at various points, and the markings are different depending on the version of rugby being played. And the out-of-bounds area is called touch. So where we would say the ball went out of bounds, they would say it went into touch, or that it's in touch. A rugby match
That is a massive missed opportunity to say the ball was out of touch. Is anyone with me?
begins similarly to an American football game. There is a coin toss to determine who kicks off, and the team that receives the kickoff attempts to move the ball down the field to score, while the team that kicked off tries to stop them. The team with possession of the oval-shaped ball is allowed to move it by running with it, kicking it, or tossing it laterally or backwards. Forward passes are not allowed, and an offensive team is not even permitted to play a ball that has been knocked or fumbled forward, even if the knock or the fumble was unintentional. You are allowed.
Isn't that taking it one step too far? I mean, whoever created this game just did not like going forwards. They were just driving around with their car in reverse the whole time. Interesting.
Allowed to punt the ball forward. The punt is often used to clear the ball out, similar to the purpose of the punt in American football, but the punt is also used offensively in rugby, which makes it the closest thing to the forward pass in American football. Just like in American football, defenders are allowed to...
Now hold on, I could have sworn I've gotten some comments that when you kick the ball, it has to be in line with your teammate, like it can't be in front of him. Oh, I think that might have been a reference to just when it hits the ground and it like bounces on the ground. So that's different from punting, which is just it's in the air the whole time.
To make contact with and tackle the ball carrier. Once the ball carrier has been brought to the ground, the tackling defender is required to release the tackle, and the ball carrier is required to give up the ball, which usually involves getting it to a teammate to continue play. The rules.
That is crazy. So once you tackle someone when you're on defense, you have to get up immediately, and the person who got tackled has to give the ball away immediately. I really like that, man. That's my favorite thing about rugby. The action never stops. That's what's so annoying about American football. They're constantly, it's like every 5 seconds the play's over, then they have to set up again and do it again. I mean, just come on, people.
Rules governing exactly what happens after a tackle has been made differ depending on which version of rugby is being played, and this is the biggest difference between the two codes of rugby. So we're going to be looking at this topic of what happens after a tackle in its own section later in the video. All right, let's talk about scoring. The objective in rugby is to score points, either by kicking the ball through the uprights, which is called a field goal, or by bringing the ball past the try line and touching it to the ground, which is called a try and is very similar to a touchdown. Just like the touchdown in American football, a try is worth more than a field goal, and after a team has scored a try, they get a free kick at the goalposts, which is called a conversion. A team can also score points via penalty kicks, which are uncontested kicks at the uprights that happen after penalties, similar to foul shots in basketball. The number of points earned by all of these things differs depending on which version of rugby you're watching. After points are scored, the team that got scored on kicks off to the team who just scored. So yeah, they go hard. A rugby player is only allowed to make a play on the ball or influence the game.
That just hit me. The team who got scored on kicks off to the team who scored? Dang, that is intense. So that means that there's got to be some games in rugby history where it was just like one team had the ball the whole time and just kept scoring over and over. Then they kept getting the ball back, and then they scored more, and then they got the ball back, and it's just like a vicious cycle of one team having the ball. That's crazy.
If they are onside. During play, being onside generally means being behind the ball from your perspective. Being offside itself is not a penalty, but it becomes a penalty when an offside player attempts to make a play on the ball or interferes with the game. There are some more specific rules governing offside, including for some set pieces, and those are outside of the scope of this video. Let's talk about that ball real quick. The rugby ball is the same length as an American football, but it is a bit wider and has rounded ends. This makes it a lot less aerodynamic, of course, but that doesn't matter because you're not throwing the ball forward in rugby. In rugby, the play rarely stops except for a few specific reasons. These include, number one, if scoring has happened. Number two, if the ball is moved forward by an offensive player by any means except for carrying it or kicking it. Number three, if the ball goes into touch. Number four, if there's a penalty.
So the fact that the action rarely stops, it's kind of hitting me. Rugby is like hand soccer, but it only goes backwards instead of forwards.
And number five, if there's an injury. Otherwise, play pretty much keeps going. So in this sense, it's a much more kinetic game than American football. When play restarts after being stopped, it is generally restarted via something called a set piece. If you play soccer, you're familiar with set pieces. The main set pieces in rugby union are the line out, which looks like this and is how play is restarted when the ball goes into touch, and the scrum, which looks like this and is how play is restarted after certain minor infractions or when the ball becomes unplayable but stays in bounds.
Owie, that'll give you a headache.
The scrum is intensely physical in rugby union, and there are strict and specific rules governing the scrum. In rugby league, the scrum is the only set piece, so it's how play is restarted anytime it needs to be restarted. But unlike the scrum in rugby union, the rugby league scrum is more of a formation than a physical contest, and the team that is awarded a scrum almost always gets possession of the ball. Compare these rugby league scrums to this rugby union scrum. This is another clue as to which version of rugby you're watching. I want to do a quick history lesson so you can get a sense of why rugby and American football are as similar as they are.
A bit of history.
The easiest way to start the history portion of this video is by acknowledging that most forms of football played around the world trace their roots back to the football games played in medieval Europe and medieval England in particular. These games belong to a wider category of game that has been played around the world throughout history, in which two groups of people, and it's usually a large number of people, compete with one another to kick, carry, and or toss a ball or other object into some sort of goal or across some sort of line or into some sort of goal area, almost always through violence. This type of game was already known by the name football in England by the 1300s, and the name football appears to have been in wide use by the 1500s. Today, these medieval games are often called mob football to evoke the chaos and anarchy that define them. And football was often banned by kings and within various jurisdictions due to the destruction and injury that it brought. By the
So basically what he's saying is that the Brits have been very violent about their sports since the 1300s. So they have a bit of a history, you might say.
1800s, this type of game was being played in a more organized way at schools and sporting clubs throughout the English-speaking world, including the United States and Canada. Up until the mid-1800s, each school or club played by its own rules, and these rules could differ greatly. So when schools played against one another, they had to agree on the rules of each individual match. Eventually, standard forms of football developed, and the first one to catch on widely was a version played at the rugby school in England. This is the game that the modern forms of rugby descend from, and it was the version of football that directly inspired what we now call football in America. McGill University in Montreal was the first North American school to base their rules on rugby rules, which had been brought to Canada by British soldiers. Harvard University.
Look at those guys. Why are their shirts so long?
University's football team then learned this version of football during a series of matches between the two schools in 1874. Rugby-style football soon spread to other universities, including Princeton, Yale, Tufts, Columbia, and the University of Michigan, and quickly became the most popular form of football in the United States. In fact, for the first few decades of American football, the terms rugby and football seem to have been used interchangeably. And when we look at the...
Now that's interesting. When did the change occur, and when did the word soccer come into the mix?
rule books from the time, we see that early American football resembled rugby much more closely than what we would identify as American football today. And even though American football has evolved into its own distinct sport, there are still some vestiges of its roots as what you could call a variation on rugby football. For example, we still call this a touchdown, even though we are long past the point where a player has to actually touch the ball down on the ground to score as they do in rugby. All right, I hope knowing that bit of history helps put everything into context.
Although it is worth noting, sometimes in American football, they do touch the ball on the ground. Not that they have to, but there are a lot of touchdown clips where the player is reaching over the line and then basically incidentally slams the ball on the ground. So it can be similar, even though the rules aren't.
Let's go on now and talk about the most significant difference between the two codes of rugby.
The biggest difference between rugby union and league.
As you could tell from the general overview, the two codes of rugby share a lot in common, and the majority of their differences are easily explained. And this makes sense because up until 1895, there was only one code of rugby. The split happened because a group of teams in northern England felt that they were being overlooked by the London-based Rugby Football Union, and also because they wanted to get paid. It seems unthinkable today, but the idea of a full-time professional athlete is actually a relatively new thing. And this topic is...
So basically it was like the Protestant Reformation, but for sports. Sorry, I'm trying to be as controversial as I possibly can. I don't know why.
It's interesting enough that it probably deserves its own video. So let me know in the comments if you would be interested in that video. Anyway, so in 1895, that group of teams in Northern England created their own governing organization, which eventually became known as the Rugby Football League. And the two codes of rugby began evolving independently of one another. Today, the two codes are different enough from one another that they are generally considered to be two distinct sports. We covered most of the differences between rugby union and rugby league already, but there's one difference that to me is significant enough that I think it deserves its own section of this video, and that is what happens after a ball carrier has been tackled. This fundamental question has a dramatic effect on the strategy, gameplay, and overall flow of the action in rugby. And ultimately, this question defines the distinct personalities of each game. You'll remember from the general overview that a tackled player in rugby is required to give up the ball, and the tackling defender is required to release the tackle. This applies to both rugby codes. What happens next is unique to each game. Let's get into it, and we'll start with rugby league because rugby league operates much more like American football after a tackle. In rugby league, which again is the one that's more popular in Australia and has the field similar to American football, each team can only maintain possession of the ball for 6 tackles. So this is similar to the 4 downs in American football, but you can think of it as 5 downs because they consider the tackle after a punt or a kickoff to be the 0 tackle. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, in rugby league, after the ball carrier has been tackled, the defense is required to clear out at least 10 meters and allow the offense to play the ball uncontested. This is officially called the play the ball. So you can think of rugby league as having a 10-meter neutral zone after each tackle. The exception to this are 2 defenders called the markers.
Okay, we have an exception, because I was just about to say, if you tackle someone, then you have to leave, and they throw it to someone else who's right next to them. Do you just, go, zigzag to the person you tackled, then to the next person, and, back and forth like that? But apparently not. We have 2 markers. Let's see what that means.
Who are allowed to be near the ball, but they're not allowed to interfere. So I guess they're there to keep the offense honest. I don't know. Any defensive player besides the markers who is not retrieved.
Okay, that's kind of dumb. I don't like that. They're allowed to be near the ball, but they can't interfere. Then what's the point of even being near the ball in that case?
Treated 10 meters is considered offside. So they have to get onside before they're allowed to affect the game in any way. In rugby league, there are no first downs. So a rugby league offense has to score before its 6th tackle or else it gives up possession. This means that if a team is on its 6th tackle and is not close to scoring, the team will usually just punt the ball away like in American football. The difference, of course, is that the punt is a live ball in any form of rugby. So if a member of the offense catches it, they can try to score or at least push the ball as far as possible on their final tackle, as opposed to American.
That is fascinating. That is really cool. Man, that makes a punt way more interesting. I really like that rule. I bet there are some crazy clips online of a player on offense just punting the ball away, and all of a sudden one of his teammates on offense swoops in out of nowhere and catches it, and then brings it into the goal area and scores. If you know any clips like that, let me know in the comments because I would like to see that. But yeah, I really like that rule.
In football, where a team fully gives up possession by punting. If a team does not score and gets tackled a sixth time, they become the defense and have to clear out 10 meters so that their opponents can play the ball uncontested. Real quick, because I know it will come up in the comments, I will say that there are a few ways that a team can get a fresh set of 6 tackles, and those are outside the scope of this video. All right, now we're going to talk about what happens after a tackle in rugby union. In rugby union, the ball is always live, and it's always able to be contested. So in rugby union, there's no concept of uncontested possession or downs. And there's no limit to the number of times an offense can be tackled while they have possession of the ball. If the ball carrier is tackled in rugby union and the defender is able to get to the ball before the offense, it's a turnover, which is pretty good on the defender. Because
I have a suspicion that most men are going to prefer rugby union for this reason. I mean, I feel like we're a little more prone to violence, and I'm no exception, so I'm on the side of rugby union at this point.
of this possibility, there's almost always a teammate of the ball carrier ready to receive the ball after a tackle, and the defense often doesn't try to contest this handover. But it's also common for the defense and the offense to both engage over the ball after a tackle, which creates a situation called a ruck. The ruck is a vocabulary term and is an official thing in rugby. Once the referee announces a ruck has formed, there are strict...
Yeah, I feel like visually, that's what I'm used to seeing in rugby, like a bunch of people piled on top of each other. Like if you had asked me what rugby is like before I had ever seen any clips of it, I'd be like, oh yeah, it's like a bunch of people like piling on top of each other trying to get the ball. So that's what's in my mind visually when I think of rugby.
Strict rules governing what is allowed to happen to keep things from becoming a violent free-for-all. For example, players are required to remain on their feet during a ruck, and players can only join the ruck from the back, from their perspective. The most significant rule, maybe, is that players are not allowed to place their hand...
It's just so funny how all these rules get put in over time. There was always some crazy incident that happened that caused a rule change. And who knows, in the history of this sport, all of the injuries and incidents that led to the rules. I can only imagine.
Hands inside the ruck, which means that players need to use their feet to bring the ball to the back of the ruck, and or players need to physically push the ruck or engage with the bodies of the opposing team so that a player at the back of the ruck or from outside of the ruck can pick up the ball. Rucks are often resolved quickly, but sometimes they get extended, for lack of a better term. That's all we're going to say about the ruck in this video. So that's the biggest difference between rugby league and rugby union, at least to my eye. And it's what gives each of these sports their own personality. Because the offense is guaranteed the ball after most tackles, the action in rugby league is more predictable and compartmentalized, and it's easy to make sense of it if you're coming at it from the perspective of an American football fan. Rugby union is more kinetic and is more of a perpetual scramble because the ball is essentially always live, even after a tackle.
All right, well, I learned a lot. That's interesting. Two different kinds of rugby, one in which the ball is always live and is much more kinetic than the other one. Wait, so hold on. Does that mean that there are never any rucks in the kind of rugby where they aren't all allowed to jump on the ball? So like is a ruck just a feature of rugby union, I believe? But yeah, if you want me to react to more rugby videos, let me know. If there are any particular games or players you want me to react to, be sure to let me know that as well. I wonder if I should join my local rugby team. I highly doubt I have one, but who knows, maybe I'll start one and I'll be the tall, skinny guy who's always getting taken out at the knees. That'll be thrilling. Well, anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I have forgotten to ask people to do that. Subscribe.